There's a woman alive today who once stood in a military kitchen with flour on her hands and a four-star general's rage aimed at her chest like a loaded gun. She did not flinch. She did not apologize. She opened her mouth and said the word that no enlisted soldier, no officer, no man or woman in that building had ever dared to say to him. She said no. What happened after that word left her lips changed everything. Her rank, her reputation, the way an entire base looked at the woman they had laughed about for years behind her back. But before we get to that moment, before we stand with her in that kitchen with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the silence so thick you could choke on it, we need to go back, way back, to a girl who grew up in a house where the stove was the only safe place to stand. Her name was Clara Benson. She was born in 1971 in a small town outside of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the kind of town where the military base was the economy, where every family either had someone enlisted or had someone who wished they were. Her father was a mechanic at a car dealership that survived on military families buying used trucks they could barely afford. Her mother cleaned houses on the base, 3 or 4 a day, coming home smelling like other people's bleach and other people's lives. Clara was the middle child of 5, 2 brothers older, 2 sisters younger. The kind of family where you learned early that attention was a resource, and you either fought for it or you disappeared. Clara disappeared. She was not loud like her brothers, not cute and dramatic like her younger sisters. She was the one who stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her mother move through the chaos of dinner with a focus that blocked out everything. The yelling from the living room, the dog barking, the television too loud, her father's mood swinging like a screen door in a storm. Her mother cooked the way some people pray, with her whole body, with concentration that turned the noise into nothing. And Clara watched. Not the way children watch to be helpful, but the way someone watches a person survive. She understood, even at 7 years old, that the kitchen was her mother's country, the one place in that house where the woman had authority, where nobody questioned what she was doing or told her she was wrong. The stove was her throne. The cutting board was her office. And the meals she put on that table every night were not just food. They were proof. Proof that she could build something good out of almost nothing. Proof that she mattered. Clara started cooking at 8. Not because anyone asked her to, because she wanted to stand in that country too. She burned things. She oversalted. She once put so much cayenne pepper in a pot of soup that her brother spit it across the table, and her father laughed so hard he forgot to be angry for a whole evening. That was the first time Clara understood that food had power beyond taste. It could change the weather inside a room. By 12, she was cooking dinner 3 nights a week. Her mother worked late on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, cleaning the bigger houses on the officer side of the base, the ones with 2 stories and yards that looked like someone actually cared. On those nights, Clara ran the kitchen. She made what they had: chicken legs and rice, canned green beans doctored with garlic powder, and a little bacon grease. Cornbread from a box mix that she learned to improve with a spoonful of honey and a splash of buttermilk she saved from Sunday baking. Nobody praised her for it. That was not how her family operated. You did what needed doing. You filled the gap. Praise was for people who did something extra, and feeding your family was not extra. It was baseline. Clara absorbed this. She filed it somewhere deep in the architecture of her self-worth, in the place where a different kind of girl might have stored confidence. What Clara stored instead was a quiet, stubborn belief that she could be essential without ever being seen. She graduated high school in 1989 with average grades and no plan. College was not a conversation that happened in her house. Her older brothers had both enlisted, one Army, one Marines. Her father assumed Clara would do what her mother did: clean houses, maybe get a job at the PX on base, marry somebody in uniform, have kids, repeat the cycle with minor variations until she was old. He did not say this with cruelty. He said it with the certainty of a man who believed the world was a fixed size and you fit where you fit. Clara enlisted in the Army the same week she turned 18. She did not enlist to fight. She did not enlist for patriotism. She enlisted because a recruiter at a strip mall told her that the Army had a culinary program, that she could train as a food service specialist, that she could cook for a living and get paid for it, and get health insurance, and see places beyond the 12-mile radius she had orbited her entire life. He said the word career. He said the word professional. These were words no one had ever connected to Clara's hands before. She signed the papers on a folding table next to a pretzel stand in the mall. The pen was chained to the clipboard. She remembers that detail. The pen was chained, like even the instrument of your future could not be trusted not to run. Basic training nearly broke her. Not the physical part, though that was hard enough. Clara was not athletic. She was built like her mother, short and solid, strong in a way women get strong from carrying laundry baskets and cast iron skillets, not from running or doing push-ups in the red Carolina mud. She survived the runs. She survived the drills. What nearly broke her was the noise. She had spent her whole life building silence around herself like a wall. In basic training, there was no silence. There was screaming in her face at 5 in the morning. There was the sound of 40 women breathing in a barracks at night, some of them crying, some of them talking in their sleep, one of them always snoring like a diesel engine trying to start. There was the mess hall, 300 bodies crammed together, trays slamming, voices bouncing off concrete walls, sergeants walking the rows looking for weakness the way dogs look for rabbits. Clara survived by doing what she had always done. She disappeared. She became the one they did not notice. She completed every task without complaint, without flair, without the kind of personality that made drill sergeants either love you or target you. She was wallpaper. She was furniture. She was the recruit whose name you had to check the roster to remember. She graduated basic and went straight to the food service MOS training at Fort Lee, Virginia. And here, for the first time in her life, something inside Clara Benson caught fire. The Army's culinary training was not fancy. It was institutional. It was learning to cook for hundreds, sometimes thousands, with equipment the size of small cars, and ingredients that came in cans so large you needed 2 hands to open them. It was learning food safety regulations, inventory management, nutrition standards. It was learning to peel 50 pounds of potatoes in under an hour and to season a vat of soup that could fill a bathtub. Clara loved every minute of it. She loved the scale. She loved the discipline. She loved that there were rules, temperatures, times, ratios, and that if you followed them with precision, the food came out right. Not sometimes right. Not right if you were lucky. Right because you did it right. There was a cause and an effect, and the effect was something you could see and smell and serve to another human being who would eat it and be full. In a life where so little had been within her control, the kitchen gave her jurisdiction over outcomes. She graduated top of her class. Nobody noticed. There was no ceremony for it, no special recognition. Her instructor, a staff sergeant named Moody, who had been cooking in Army kitchens for 19 years and had the knees and the burn scars to prove it, pulled her aside on the last day and said something she would carry for the rest of her career. He said, "Benson, you've got the hands. Most people in this program learn to cook. You already knew. What you learned here is how to cook for a mission. Don't let them waste you." She did not fully understand what he meant until she got to her first duty station. Fort Hood, Texas, 1990. She was assigned to a dining facility that served one of the largest active duty populations in the country. The kitchen was enormous, industrial, loud, and run by a team of food service specialists who had, over many years, perfected the art of doing the absolute minimum required to not get written up. The food was edible in the same way that cardboard is technically chewable. It met nutritional requirements. It met safety standards. It met the baseline, and the baseline was where it lived, and nobody expected anything more because nobody believed anything more was possible from an Army kitchen. Clara could not stand it. She had come from a house where food was the only beautiful thing, where her mother turned commodity cheese and day-old bread into something that made 5 children stop fighting long enough to sit at a table together. And here she was in a kitchen with a budget and equipment and ingredients that her mother would have wept to have access to, and they were producing garbage. Flavorless, joyless, assembly line garbage that soldiers scraped into trash cans with the same expression they used for filling out paperwork. She started small. She did not announce what she was doing. She did not ask permission. On a Tuesday morning, when she was assigned to the breakfast line, she added fresh chives and a little white pepper to the scrambled eggs. Not a lot, just enough. The eggs went from yellow rubber to something that actually tasted like a person made them on purpose. Nobody said anything, but the serving pan emptied 20 minutes faster than usual. The next day, she adjusted the grits. A pat of real butter. She found it buried in the back of the walk-in cooler behind a case of expired pudding cups nobody had bothered to inventory out, and a pinch of salt that was slightly heavier than regulation. The grits went from wallpaper paste to something a soldier could actually swallow without making a face. She kept going, quietly, the way she did everything. She stayed within the official recipes, but pushed them. A little garlic where garlic was not listed. A slightly longer roast time on the chicken thighs, so the skin crisped instead of sitting there pale and sat like skin that had given up on life. She learned which spices the kitchen had, but nobody used. There was an entire shelf of oregano, cumin, and smoked paprika that had been ordered by a previous cook, and then ignored like library books nobody checked out. Within a month, the dining facility line was longer. Not because the food was suddenly restaurant quality. It was still institutional cooking, but it was institutional cooking that someone cared about, and soldiers could taste the difference the way you can feel the difference between a letter someone typed and a letter someone wrote by hand. The effort was in the flavor, and effort in a place where most things were done because regulation demanded it was a kind of rebellion. Clara's supervisor, a sergeant first class named Detweiler, noticed, not with pleasure, with suspicion. Detweiler had been running that kitchen for 6 years, and he ran it the way he ran everything in his life. By the book, no surprises, nothing that could generate a complaint or an inspection flag or a question from above. Clara's adjustments, small as they were deviations. And Detweiler hated deviations the way a man who has built his entire career on the absence of problems hates anything that might become one. He called her into his office, which was a windowless room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, and told her to stop. "You're not here to be creative, Benson," he said. He was sitting behind a metal desk that had nothing on it except a regulation manual and a stapler. "You're here to follow the recipe cards. The recipe cards exist for a reason. They are tested. They are approved. They are nutritionally calibrated. You follow them." Clara stood at parade rest because she was supposed to, and she said, "Yes, Sergeant." She did not stop. She just got smarter about it. She made her adjustments earlier in the morning, before Detweiler arrived. She cleaned as she went, leaving no trace of the extra garlic, the unauthorized butter, the spice shelf she had reorganized so she could find things in the dark if she had to. She became a ghost cook, a culinary insurgent operating inside the system, producing meals that were technically within regulation, but tasted like someone had read the recipe card and then whispered to it, "I can do better than you." The soldiers noticed. Not all of them, and not in ways they could articulate. Most of them did not think about food beyond whether it was hot and whether there was enough of it. But a few of them, the ones who had grown up in houses where food meant something, where a grandmother's kitchen was a church and a mother's Sunday dinner was a sermon, those soldiers tasted what Clara was doing, and they came back. They came back to the dining facility instead of going off base to Taco Bell. They came back, and they stood in line, and they did not know they were tasting defiance, but they were. Clara's first year at Fort Hood taught her two things. The first was that she was good at this, genuinely good, not just competent, but gifted in the way that people are gifted when their hands know things their mind has not yet put into words. The second was that being good at something the Army considered low status was its own kind of prison. Food service specialists were the bottom. Everyone knew it. The infantry guys called them spatula soldiers. The mechanics called them lunch ladies. Even within the support structure of the base, the cooks were the ones people joked about, the ones whose work was consumed and forgotten 3 times a day, the ones whose skill was invisible precisely because it was constant. Clara heard the jokes. She heard them in the chow line, in the hallways, in the break room, where she ate her own meals standing up because there was always something else to prep. She heard a lieutenant once say, within earshot, That food service was where the army put people who could not do anything else. She heard it and she did not react, not with her face, not with her body, not with a single outward sign that the words had landed. But they did land. They landed in the same place where her father's assumptions about her future had landed, in the same place where Detweiler's order to stop caring had landed, in that deep architecture of her self-worth where the foundation was solid, but the walls had never been finished. She kept cooking. She kept improving. She kept disappearing into the work, because the work was the one thing that could not be taken from her by someone else's opinion of it. The food was good. The food was getting better. And nobody who mattered was paying attention. The Gulf War started. Clara did not deploy with the first wave, but she deployed. She went to Saudi Arabia in early 1991 as part of support unit, and she cooked in a field kitchen in the desert for 4 months. The conditions were brutal. Sand got into everything. The flour, the oil, the crevices of the field stoves that were already barely functional. The heat warped metal pans and turned butter into liquid before it hit the surface. Water was rationed. Ingredients were limited to what could survive a supply chain that stretched across an ocean and a desert. Clara cooked the best food of her life. She does not know why. She has said in interviews since then that something about the constraints freed her. When you have nothing, you cannot be precious. You cannot overthink. You have canned tomatoes and dried herbs and a stove that tilts 15 degrees to the left and 200 soldiers who have been eating MREs for weeks and whose morale is sitting somewhere around their ankles. You cook. You make it work. You make canned tomatoes and dried oregano and whatever protein showed up on the last truck into something that smells like someone's kitchen back home. And you watch 200 exhausted faces change when they smell it. And you understand in your body, in your bones, not in your head, that this is not a low-status job. This is the job. This is the thing that keeps people human when everything around them is trying to make them into something else. She came back from the Gulf with no medals, no commendations, no official recognition for the work she had done. Her deployment evaluation noted that she had performed food service duties satisfactorily. Satisfactorily. For months of desert cooking, of making miracles out of canned goods and sand-contaminated equipment. And the word they chose was satisfactorily. Clara read that evaluation in a hallway at Fort Hood on a Tuesday afternoon. She folded it and put it in her pocket and walked to the kitchen and prepped dinner for 600 people and did not say a word about it to anyone. She was 20 years old. The next 5 years were a slow grind. Clara moved through the ranks the way water moves through limestone, persistently, invisibly, one molecule at a time. She made specialist. She made corporal. She made sergeant. Each promotion came later than it should have, delayed by supervisors who did not see food service as a priority, by a system that rewarded combat roles and tolerated support roles, and forgot entirely about the people who kept everyone fed. She transferred twice, Fort Campbell, then Fort Lewis. At each new posting, she walked into a kitchen that had given up on itself, and she began the same quiet war. Better seasoning, longer cooking times, proper knife technique that reduced waste and improved texture. She taught younger cooks without being asked to, standing beside them at the prep station and showing them how to hold a blade, how to read the oil in a pan by its shimmer, how to taste as they went instead of waiting until the end when it was too late to fix anything. She never yelled. She never pulled rank. She taught the way her mother had taught her, by standing close and doing it right and trusting that the person beside her would absorb what they needed to absorb. By 1997, she was a staff sergeant running a kitchen at Fort Lewis that had gone from the worst-rated dining facility on base to the second best in under 18 months. The improvement was measurable. Food waste decreased, soldier satisfaction surveys ticked upward, health inspection scores climbed. Clara had done this with the same budget, the same equipment, the same ingredients as every other kitchen on base. The only variable she had changed was the care, the attention, the insistence that food prepared for soldiers was not a chore to be survived, but a craft to be practiced. The base commander at Fort Lewis, a colonel named Hargrove, took notice. He was the first senior officer in Clara's career to walk in her kitchen, taste the food, and say out loud what no one had said before. "This is excellent, Sergeant Benson. This is genuinely excellent." Clara stood at attention and said, "Thank you, sir." And then she went back to the stove because the gravy needed stirring, and gravy does not care about compliments. Colonel Hargrove recommended Clara for the prestigious Connolly Award, a military honor for excellence in food service. She won it. The ceremony was small, held in a conference room with fluorescent lighting and metal folding chairs. Clara wore her dress uniform, which she had ironed 3 times that morning because the creases were not sharp enough the first 2 times. She accepted the plaque and shook hands and stood for a photo that would appear in the base newspaper on page 7, below an article about a new parking policy. She went back to work the next day. The plaque went into a box under her bunk. The award should have open doors. In a fair system, it would have. But the military food service track was a narrow corridor with a low ceiling, and Clara was pressing her head against that ceiling every day. She could not advance beyond a certain rank without transitioning to a role that took her out of the kitchen, administrative positions, logistics management, the kind of desk work that the Army considered real career progression. The message was embedded in the structure itself. Cooking was a skill, not a career. You did it until you graduated to something that mattered. Clara refused to leave the kitchen. This was not stubbornness, though her supervisors called it that. It was conviction. She believed, with the same quiet intensity that her mother had brought to every meal in that small house outside Fort Bragg, that feeding people was important work, that it deserved to be done well, that the soldiers who ate her food were not units to be fueled, but people to be nourished, and that the difference between fueling and nourishing was the difference between a machine and a human being. This conviction would cost her. It would cost her promotions, opportunities, the respect of peers who could not understand why she would choose a spatula over a desk. But it would also carry her. It would carry her all the way to a kitchen where a 4-star general would stand in front of her and make a demand that would force Clara Benson to decide, once and for all, whether she was just the cook or something else entirely. That moment was still 3 years away, and Clara had no idea it was coming. She just kept stirring the gravy. The transfer orders came in March of 2000. Clara was being moved to Fort Myer, Virginia, one of the most prestigious postings in the entire United States Army. Fort Myer sat adjacent to Arlington National Cemetery, within walking distance of the Pentagon, and served as the home installation for some of the highest-ranking officers in the military. The base hosted state dinners, diplomatic functions, retirement ceremonies for generals, and the kind of official events where the food was not just food, but a statement, a performance, a representation of the United States Army's ability to operate at the highest level in all things, including what it put on the table. Clara did not request this transfer. She did not even know it was being considered until the paperwork appeared in her hands. Colonel Hargrove, the Fort Lewis commander who had tasted her cooking and actually said the word excellent out loud in a room where people could hear him, had recommended her. He had called someone who knew someone on the staffing committee at Fort Myer, and he had told them that he had a staff sergeant in his kitchen who could turn a government-issued pork loin into something a senator would compliment, and that if they were serious about improving the food service at the most visible Army installation in the country, they should bring her in. Clara packed her things into 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box. She had been in the Army for 11 years, and everything she owned fit in a space smaller than a bathtub. She was 29 years old. She had never been to Washington, D.C. She had never cooked for anyone whose rank made the room change temperature when they walked in. Fort Myer was a different planet. The kitchens were immaculate, stainless steel surfaces polished to a mirror shine, walk-in coolers organized with the precision of a surgical instrument tray, equipment that had been maintained and updated and actually worked the way it was supposed to work. After years of cooking on stoves held together with duct tape and creative profanity, Clara stood in the Fort Myer kitchen on her first morning, and touch the burner knobs the way someone touches a new car they cannot believe they are allowed to drive. The ingredients were different too. Not just canned goods and frozen bulk. Fresh herbs, actual cuts of meat from actual butchers, produce that had color and firmness and had not spent 3 weeks in a supply chain truck turning slowly into a suggestion of what it used to be. Clara picked up a tomato from the prep station and held it, and it was red, genuinely red, not the pale pinkish orange of institutional tomatoes, but the red of a tomato that had been grown on purpose and picked at the right time and delivered with something resembling care. She almost cried. She did not cry, but the muscles in her face did a thing she was not prepared for, and she had to turn away from the prep cook standing next to her and pretend she was checking the temperature gauge on the oven. The team at Fort Myer was different too. These were not cooks who had given up. These were specialists who had been selected for this posting because they were competent and reliable and capable of producing food that would not embarrass the Army in front of people who mattered. They were professional. They were skilled. And they operated under a system that Clara recognized immediately because she had been fighting against it her entire career. The system was follow the plan. Execute the menu. Do not deviate. Do not improvise. Do not bring anything of yourself to the plate, because the plate is not about you. The plate is about the Army. The plate is about protocol. The plate is about a 4-star general sitting at a table with a foreign dignitary, and both of them experiencing food that is correct, not inspired, not memorable, not the kind of food that makes someone close their eyes for a second because a flavor just unlocked a room in their memory they forgot they had. Correct. Safe. Unassailable. Clara understood this system. She had been understanding it and fighting it quietly for over a decade. But Fort Myer was not Fort Hood. Fort Myer was not a dining facility serving privates who would eat anything that was hot and not visibly wrong. Fort Myer was the show kitchen, the one where the stakes were political, where a bad meal could become a diplomatic incident, where the people eating the food had eaten at the best restaurants in the world and would notice with irritation if the risotto was overcooked or the sauce had broken or the plating looked like it had been done by someone who had never seen a plate used for anything other than holding food. Clara's immediate supervisor at Fort Myer was a master sergeant named Pauline Cates. Cates was 51 years old, had been in the Army for 28 years, and ran the Fort Myer kitchen with the same energy a head nurse runs a trauma ward. Nothing surprised her. Nothing impressed her. She had cooked for presidents. She had cooked for NATO commanders. She had once prepared a 7-course meal for a state dinner during a power outage using nothing but gas burners and portable lanterns, and the Secretary of Defense had complimented the beef tenderloin without ever knowing the lights were out in the kitchen behind swinging doors. Cates looked at Clara's file on her first day. She read the Connolly Award. She read the efficiency reports, the transfer recommendations, Colonel Hargrove's note. She closed the file and looked at Clara and said, "Can you actually cook? Or did you just impress someone who doesn't know the difference?" Clara said, "Put me on the line and find out." Cates almost smiled. Almost. The muscles moved a quarter of the distance required and then stopped, which for Cates was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Clara spent her first 3 months at Fort Myer in observation mode. She cooked. She executed the menus as written. She followed the plans, met the standards, demonstrated that she could operate at the level required without deviation. She learned the rhythms of the kitchen, which events were high priority, which generals had dietary restrictions, which diplomatic functions required specific cultural considerations in the menu planning. She learned that the Japanese ambassador's wife was allergic to shellfish. She learned that a certain retired 4-star general who attended every ceremony insisted on having his steak cooked medium well, which was a crime against the animal that gave its life for that steak. But the man had more stars on his shoulder than Clara had years in the kitchen, so medium well it was. She watched Cates. She watched the way Cates moved through the kitchen with authority that had nothing to do with volume. Cates never raised her voice. She did not need to. When Cates said, "That sauce is thin," the cook responsible felt it in their skeleton. When Cates tasted something and said nothing, you knew it was acceptable. When Kate tasted something and looked at you, just looked with those gray eyes that had seen every mistake a kitchen could produce, you knew you had done something worth doing. Clara wanted Kate to look at her like that. It happened on a Thursday in June. Clara was assigned to prepare the side dishes for a retirement dinner honoring a brigadier general who had served for 32 years. The menu called for roasted asparagus, garlic mashed potatoes, and a wild rice pilaf. Standard. Safe. The kind of sides that existed not to be noticed, but to not be wrong. Clara followed the recipe for the asparagus and the potatoes. But when she got to the wild rice pilaf, something in her hands rebelled. The recipe called for wild rice, chicken broth, diced onion, salt, and pepper. 5 ingredients. A dish designed to fill space on a plate the way silence fills space in an elevator. Present but meaningless. She looked at the spice shelf. She looked at the walk-in cooler. She looked at the clock. She had 40 minutes before plating. She toasted the rice dry in the pan first, letting it crackle and pop until it smelled like roasted nuts instead of nothing. She sautéed the onion with minced shallots she found tucked behind a case of chicken stock, adding a splash of white wine from a bottle that had been opened for a sauce the day before, and was still good. She stirred in dried cranberries, just a handful for sweetness and color. She finished with a scatter of toasted pecans and a whisper of fresh thyme she stripped from a stem with one practiced pull of her fingers. The pilaf went out. It sat beside the asparagus and the potatoes on 200 plates that were carried through the swinging doors by servers in white gloves. Clara stood in the kitchen and watched the plates leave and waited. Kate found her 30 minutes later. She was standing by the dish station, scrubbing a pan she had already scrubbed twice. Kate walked up and stood beside her and did not say anything for a long moment. Clara kept scrubbing. The pilaf, Kate said. Clara's hand stopped. That wasn't the recipe card. No, Master Sergeant. The cranberries. The pecans. The thyme. Yes, Master Sergeant. Kate was quiet. Clara waited for the correction, for the write-up, for the conversation she had been having with every supervisor since Detweiler at Fort Hood, the conversation where someone in authority told her to stop caring so much, to stop treating Army food like it deserved better than the minimum. Kate said, "The general's wife asked for the recipe." Clara looked up. She asked which restaurant we hired to cater the sides. Clara's chest did something she could not name. A sensation like a fist unclenching inside her ribcage, knuckle by knuckle, something that had been closed for so long she had forgotten it was capable of opening. "Don't go off recipe again without telling me first," Kate said. "But Benson." "Yes, Master Sergeant. That was a damn fine pilaf." Kate walked away. Clara stood at the dish station with her hands in soapy water and her face doing that thing again, the thing that was not crying but was closer to crying than she was comfortable with, and she scrubbed the pan a third time because she needed to be doing something with her hands or the feeling would escape through them, and she was not ready for that. After the pilaf incident, Kate began giving Clara more latitude. Not openly. Not in any way that could be documented or challenged by someone reading the menus and comparing them to the recipe cards. But Kate would write a menu and leave certain dishes described in vague terms, seasonal vegetable preparation or grain accompaniment, chef's choice. And Clara understood that these blank spaces were invitations. Spaces where Clara could breathe. She filled them. She filled them with dishes that were still within the bounds of military food service, but pressed against those bounds the way a river presses against its banks, not breaking through, but reshaping the edges over time. She made a butternut squash soup for an autumn reception that 3 colonels' wives requested by name for their own private dinner parties. She prepared a braised short rib for a Pentagon liaison dinner that a 2-star general described as the best thing I've eaten in uniform. And I've been eating in uniform for 26 years. The soldiers noticed too. The enlisted men and women who ate in the regular dining facility, not the fancy event kitchen, started asking when that sergeant was on the line. They did not know Clara's name. They knew her food. They could taste the difference between a meal assembled by someone following instructions and a meal made by someone who believed that the person eating it mattered. Clara was promoted to Sergeant First Class in 2001. The promotion was overdue by at least a year, delayed by the same structural indifference that had slowed her entire career. Food service was still the joke. Still the job people assumed you ended up in, because you could not qualify for anything better. Clara's promotion ceremony was held in a conference room with 7 people present, one of whom was Kate's, who shook Clara's hand afterward and said, "About time," which from Kate's was a sonnet. Then, September happened. Clara was in the kitchen at Fort Myer when the planes hit. Fort Myer was close enough to the Pentagon that they heard it, a sound that was not like anything Clara had a reference for, not a crash and not an explosion, but something between a tearing sound as if the air itself had been ripped open and the world behind it was on fire. The kitchen stopped. Every hand paused. Every sound ceased except the low hum of the refrigeration units and the distant, growing wail of sirens that sounded nothing like the sirens Clara had heard before. These were different. These were the sound of something that was not a drill. Clara stood at her station with a knife in one hand and a half-diced onion in front of her, and she looked at the other cooks, 6 of them, all of them frozen, all of them staring at nothing because no one had told them what to do yet, and they were soldiers and soldiers waited for orders. Clara put down the knife. "We cook," she said. No one moved. "People are going to come here," she said. "They're going to be hurt, and they're going to be scared, and they're going to need to eat. We cook. That's what we do. We cook." She picked the knife back up and finished dicing the onion. They cooked for 14 hours straight that day. They fed first responders, displaced Pentagon staff, military personnel who had been called in from leave, chaplains, medics, people in suits covered in dust who sat at tables and stared at plates of food they did not eat and could not eat, but needed to have in front of them because the presence of a meal meant that something was still normal, that someone was still doing the basic work of keeping people alive. Clara made soup. She does not remember deciding to make soup. Her hands decided. Chicken stock, carrots, celery, onion, egg noodles, garlic thyme, a bay leaf pulled from a jar so old the label had faded. She made the kind of soup her mother made on sick days, the kind that was not medicine but worked like medicine because it was warm and it tasted like someone cared, and in a world where caring had just been used as a weapon, caring that came in the form of broth, and noodles was a small, necessary resistance. She served that soup for 3 days. She made batch after batch, adjusting the recipe each time to stretch the ingredients as supplies became uncertain. She slept on the kitchen floor for 2 nights, curled on a rubber mat behind the walk-in cooler with her apron folded under her head as a pillow. Kate slept on the other side of the cooler. Neither of them spoke about it. There was nothing to say. On the 4th day, a lieutenant colonel from the Pentagon walked into the dining facility. He had been working 18-hour shifts coordinating disaster response. He was gray-faced and hollow-eyed, and his uniform was wrinkled in places that military uniforms are never wrinkled. He sat down, and a server brought him a bowl of Clara's soup, and he ate it. He ate the whole bowl. Then he put his spoon down and pressed both hands flat on the table, as if he needed to feel something solid, and he sat there for a long time. When he stood up, he walked to the kitchen window and asked to speak to whoever made the soup. Clara came to the window. She was wearing an apron stained with stock and flour and the residue of 3 days of cooking that had not stopped. Her eyes were red. Her hands were steady. The lieutenant colonel looked at her and said, "Thank you." That was all. He turned and walked out. Clara went back to the stove. The months after September 11th changed the tempo of everything at Fort Myer. The base became a hub of increased activity. Security tightened to a level that made the air itself feel watched, and the demands on the kitchen multiplied. More events, more dignitaries, more meals prepared under heightened scrutiny because everything, every function the Army performed was now being examined through the lens of a nation that had been attacked and needed to see its institutions operating with precision. Clara cooked. She cooked through the grief that sat in the base like weather, a permanent overcast that did not lift for months. She cooked through the deployments, watching soldiers she had fed breakfast leave for Afghanistan and knowing, with the particular knowledge of someone who sees people at their most basic human moment, the moment of eating, that some of them would not come back to her line. She cooked through the memorial services, preparing food for receptions where families stood in clusters holding plates they did not touch, and looking at photographs of people who had been alive the last time they ate in this room. She did not talk about how this affected her. She talked to no one about anything that was not related to the menu, the prep schedule, the inventory, the temperature of the walk-in cooler. Kate's noticed. Kate's always noticed. But Kate's was from the same school of survival. You do not crack in the kitchen. The kitchen is the one place that holds. If the kitchen cracks, everyone feels it. In 2002, Clara was assigned to lead the food preparation for a major diplomatic reception at Fort Myer. The event was significant. High-ranking military officials from multiple NATO countries, State Department representatives, Pentagon leadership. The menu had been planned weeks in advance, approved through multiple levels of command, printed on heavy cardstock with the Army seal embossed in gold at the top. Clara studied the menu. It was fine. It was exactly what she expected. Safe, conventional, designed to offend no one and impress no one. The culinary equivalent of a diplomatic handshake that was firm enough to be respectful and soft enough to be forgettable. She cooked it as written. Almost. She made one adjustment to the dessert, a chocolate torte that the recipe called to be served plain with a dusting of powdered sugar. Clara made a raspberry coulis. Fresh raspberries, a little sugar, a squeeze of lemon, strained through a fine mesh sieve until it was smooth and vivid, the color of something alive, and drizzled it across the plate in a pattern that looked like it had been done without thinking, but had actually required her to practice the wrist motion 40 times on parchment paper the night before. The dessert went out. The reception continued. Clara cleaned the kitchen and went to bed. The next morning, Kate called her into the office. The German defense attaché's wife, Kate said, has requested the recipe for the chocolate torte. She said, and I am quoting, it was the most beautiful dessert she has seen at a military function. Clara waited. The raspberry coulis was not on the menu. No, Master Sergeant. You went off plan. I did. Kate's looked at her. That look. The one that meant you had done something worth doing. The colonel wants to know why we don't always do things like this. Clara said, because no one ever asked us to. Kate leaned back in her chair. She was quiet for a long time. Then, she said something that Clara would not understand the full weight of until years later. Benson, the problem with being invisible is that when people finally see you, they think you just appeared. They don't know you've been standing there the whole time. Clara turned this sentence over in her mind for days, the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight, its edges, its temperature. She thought about her mother standing at the stove in that small house, producing miracles that no one in the family called miracles because they happened every day. She thought about herself at 8 years old, watching, learning that the most important work in the house was the work that everyone consumed and no one acknowledged. She thought about every kitchen she had stood in for 13 years, every meal she had made better without being asked, every adjustment she had smuggled past supervisors who wanted compliance, not excellence. She had been standing in plain sight her entire career, cooking in full view, and she had been invisible because the work she did was the kind of work the world has always been most comfortable ignoring, the work of feeding, of nourishing, of sustaining. Women's work, her father would have called it. Low-status work, the Army called it. Essential work, Clara called it in the silence of her own head where no one could hear her, and no one could disagree. The years at Fort Myer settled into a rhythm. Clara built a reputation that existed in a strange space, widely known but narrowly respected. The people who ate her food admired her. The officers' wives requested her for their private events. The soldiers in the regular dining facility could identify her shifts by taste alone. But within the chain of command, within the institutional machinery that determined promotions and assignments and career trajectories, Clara remained what she had always been, a cook. Just a cook. She heard the phrase so many times it calcified into something she carried in her body, a weight distributed evenly across her shoulders and her spine, present every morning when she stood at the stove, and not fully gone when she lay down at night. She was just a cook the way her mother had been just a cleaner, the way women in service roles have always been just the word that precedes the comma, that precedes the thing they actually are. By 2003, Clara had been in the Army for 14 years. She was 32. She had won awards. She had fed soldiers in the desert. She had cooked through a national tragedy. She had made a German diplomat's wife ask for a recipe. And she was still fighting the same fight she had been fighting since Fort Hood. The fight to be allowed to care about her work in a system that treated caring as unnecessary. This was the year General Martin Briggs arrived at Fort Myer. General Briggs was a 4-star general, which meant he existed in a category of authority that most soldiers never encounter directly. A 4-star general did not walk into a room. A 4-star general restructured the room's gravitational field upon entry. People straightened. Conversations died. The air got thinner, or it felt like it did, because everyone in the vicinity started breathing differently, shorter, shallower from the top of the lungs instead of the belly, the breathing of people who are acutely aware that their next mistake could be their career. Briggs had a reputation that preceded him the way thunder precedes a storm you can already smell. He was brilliant. He was demanding. He had led combat operations with a tactical precision that earned him respect and a personal intensity that earned him something closer to fear. He believed that the Army should operate at peak performance in all things, at all times, in all conditions. He did not distinguish between a combat mission and a dinner service. Excellence was excellence. Failure was failure. The context was irrelevant. When Briggs took command of the installation, one of the first things he did was inspect the kitchen. Not the dining facility. The kitchen. He walked through the swinging doors unannounced at 6:30 in the morning, wearing his duty uniform, and his expression, the one that suggested the world had personally disappointed him, and he was giving it one more chance. Clara was at the stove. She was making oatmeal. Not Army oatmeal, which was a gray paste that sat in serving pans like wet cement and tasted like the memory of a grain that had once been alive. Clara's oatmeal was steel-cut, cooked low and slow, finished with a pinch of cinnamon and a drizzle of real maple syrup she had requisitioned through a supply chain loophole she had discovered 2 years earlier and had been quietly exploiting ever since. General Briggs walked to the stove. He looked at the oatmeal. He looked at Clara. "Sergeant," he said, "what is this?" "Oatmeal, sir." He picked up a spoon from the station. He tasted it. He stood there for a moment with the spoon in his hand, and the expression on his face doing something Clara had never seen a general's face do. It was softening, not melting, not breaking, but shifting from its default position of authoritative displeasure to something that was, if you squinted, close to surprise. "This is not regulation oatmeal," he said. "No, sir. This is exceptional oatmeal." "Thank you, sir." He put the spoon down. He looked at Clara with those eyes that could read a battlefield and a balance sheet with equal facility, and he said, "What else can you do?" Clara Benson looked at a 4-star general and said, "Everything, sir." It was the most honest sentence she had ever spoken, and she had no idea that this moment, this exchange over a pot of oatmeal at 6:30 in the morning, was the beginning of the collision that would define her career and force her to make the hardest choice of her life. General Briggs began requesting Clara specifically for high-profile events, not through Kate's, not through the chain of command, but directly through his aide-de-camp, who would call the kitchen and say, "The general wants Sergeant Benson on the dinner for Friday." This was unusual. Generals did not typically know the names of individual food service NCOs. They knew their aides, their drivers, their staff. They did not know the woman who made the oatmeal. Briggs knew Clara's name. He knew her food, and he began, in his way, to champion her. He mentioned her at a staff meeting. He told a visiting Pentagon official that Fort Myer had the finest culinary NCO in the Army. He recommended her for advanced training at a civilian culinary institute, a program that the Army occasionally sent its best cooks to, but rarely made available to anyone below the rank of Master Sergeant. Clara went to the training. She spent 6 weeks at a culinary school in upstate New York, learning techniques she had been inventing on her own for years. Emulsions, reductions, the science of flavor pairing, the art of plating. She was the only military student in a class of civilian chefs, and she was, by the assessment of her instructors, the most skilled person in the room. Not because she had more training, because she had more constraint. She had spent 14 years cooking with limitations that these civilian chefs could not imagine. Limited ingredients, limited equipment, limited authority, limited recognition. And every limitation had forced her to be more creative, more resourceful, more precise. She returned to Fort Myer with new skills and the same old rank. She was still a sergeant first class. She was still just the cook. But something had changed. General Briggs had noticed her, and being noticed by a four-star general was like being noticed by weather. It changed the landscape. It changed what was possible. And it set in motion a chain of events that would lead to a kitchen, a command, and a single word that changed everything. The word was coming. Clara did not know it yet. She was too busy dicing shallots and adjusting the seasoning on a consommé that had to be clear enough to read a newspaper through. She was too busy being excellent at a job the world told her did not matter. But the word was coming, and when it arrived, it would cost her everything she had spent 15 years building in order to give her something she had never been allowed to have. A voice. The dinner that changed everything was scheduled for Saturday in October of 2003. It was a reception for a delegation of senior military officials from 3 allied nations, Britain, France, and Germany, hosted by General Briggs at the Fort Myer Officers Club. The event was political in the way all military dinners are political, a performance of alliance and capability disguised as hospitality, where the food, the setting, the timing, and the tone were all instruments in a larger orchestra playing a single note. We are competent, we are strong, we are in control. The menu had been planned 6 weeks in advance. Clara had built it herself, the first time she had been given full authority over a menu of this scale. Kate had signed off. The colonel had signed off. General Briggs had reviewed it personally and approved it with a handwritten note in the margin that said, "Trust Benson." 2 words. Clara had folded that note and put it in the same box where she kept her Connolly Award, under her bunk, the box where she stored proof that she existed. The menu was ambitious but grounded. A chilled cucumber soup to start, made with yogurt and fresh dill and a hint of lemon that woke up the palate without attacking it. Then, a seared duck breast with a cherry reduction that required timing so precise Clara had rehearsed it 6 times. Once at 3 in the morning when the kitchen was empty, and the only audience was the hum of the walk-in cooler. A wild mushroom risotto as the side, stir by hand for 45 minutes because risotto knows when you stop paying attention and punishes you for it. And for dessert, a dark chocolate mousse with candied orange peel and a single edible flower placed with tweezers. Clara had tested every dish. She had adjusted every seasoning. She had timed every element to the minute. She knew this menu the way a musician knows a piece of music. Not just the notes, but the spaces between them, the rhythm, the breath, the silence where the silence needs to be. The day of the dinner, she arrived at the kitchen at 4 in the morning. The event was at 7 in the evening. She did not need 15 hours. She needed the quiet. She needed to stand in the kitchen before anyone else arrived and feel the space, feel the surfaces, the temperature of the room, the way the light came through the one window that looked out onto a courtyard where someone had planted rosemary in a stone planter, probably years ago, and it had grown wild and thick and smelled like something that belonged in a different country. She prepped. She organized the mise en place with the precision of a surgical tray, every ingredient measured, every garnish cut, every tool in its place. She briefed her team at noon. For cooks, 2 prep assistants, 3 servers. She walked them through the timing, the plating, the sequence of service. She told them what she always told her teams before a high-profile event. The food leaves this kitchen perfect. Not almost. Not close enough. Perfect. Because the people eating it tonight will not know our names and will not remember our faces, but they will remember how this meal made them feel. And that feeling is the only thing we get to keep. The kitchen moved. The team moved. Everything was on track. The cucumber soup was chilling. The duck breasts were seasoned and resting at room temperature. The risotto stock was simmering. The mousse was set in individual ramekins in the walk-in cooler, each one topped with a curl of orange peel that Clara had candied herself the night before, standing at the stove at 11 at night with a pot of sugar syrup and a pair of chopsticks, turning each peel until it was glossy and translucent and perfect. At 4:30 in the afternoon, General Briggs's aide-de-camp walked into the kitchen. Clara knew something was wrong before he spoke. She knew it from the way he walked, which was the walk of a person who has been given a message they do not want to deliver and has not yet found a way to make it sound like anything other than what it is. His name was Captain Torres, a young officer with a face that was designed for smiling, but was currently doing the opposite of smiling with such commitment that it looked painful. "Sergeant Benson," he said. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "Sir, the general has made a change to the menu." The kitchen did not stop. The sounds continued. The simmer of stock, the rhythmic thud of a knife on a cutting board, the low conversation of two prep cooks debating whether the mushrooms should be sliced thinner. But Clara heard the sentence the way you hear a sound in a dream, clear and impossible at the same time. "A change, sir." Captain Torres unfolded a piece of paper. It was a printed menu, the same one Clara had designed, with red ink notations in General Briggs's handwriting. The handwriting was aggressive, each letter pressed into the paper hard enough to leave an impression on the other side. The general had crossed out the duck breast. In its place, he had written steak, filet mignon, medium rare, American. He had crossed out the cherry reduction and written au jus. He had crossed out the wild mushroom risotto and written baked potato. He had crossed out the chocolate mousse and written apple pie. Clara looked at the paper. She looked at Captain Torres. She looked at the paper again. The general had taken her menu, the menu he had approved with a handwritten note that said, "Trust Benson," and he had replaced it with a steakhouse dinner. Not because the original menu was flawed. Not because there was a dietary concern or a diplomatic protocol she had missed. The note at the bottom of the page, in the same aggressive red ink, explained the reasoning in 6 words. "We serve American food to allies." Clara held the paper. The kitchen sounds continued around her. The stock simmered. The knife thudded. The prep cooks had moved on from mushroom thickness to a debate about the correct way to pronounce quinoa. Clara's hands were shaking. Not visibly, not in a way anyone could see, but she felt it in her fingertips and in her wrists, a vibration that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with 15 years of being told to be less. Be less creative. Be less ambitious. Be less herself. Follow the recipe card. Stay in the lane. Cook what you're told to cook the way you were told to cook it, and do not ever forget that you are just a cook. She looked at Captain Torres and said, "I need to speak with the general." Torres blinked. This was not a request that enlisted NCOs typically made regarding 4-star generals, particularly not 2.5 hours before diplomatic dinner. He said, "Sergeant, I need to speak with the general, sir." "About the menu." Torres hesitated. Then he said, "Wait here," and left the kitchen. Clara stood at her station. She put the paper down on the stainless steel counter. She looked at the red ink. She looked at the duck breasts resting on the tray, seasoned and ready, beautiful in the way that food is beautiful when it has been prepared with intention and skill and the kind of care that most people reserve for things that are not edible. She thought about her mother. She thought about the kitchen in that small house outside Fort Bragg, the stove that was her mother's country, the one place where the woman had authority. She thought about what it meant to cook for people, to take raw ingredients and turn them into something that could make a person close their eyes, something that could make a room go quiet, something that could remind a human being sitting in a metal folding chair in a military dining facility that they were alive, and that being alive included, among its many features, the capacity to taste something and feel grateful. She thought about what it meant to be told that none of that mattered, that the food was not the point, that the point was the message, the politics, the optics, and that her job was to deliver the message, not to make art. General Briggs arrived in the kitchen at 5:15. He walked through the swinging doors with the same gravitational authority he brought to every room, and the kitchen responded the way every room responded. It contracted. The prep cooks stopped debating. The knives went still. The simmer of the stock seemed to quiet itself, which was not physically possible, but felt emotionally accurate. He was tall. He was lean. He had the face of a man who had made decisions that cost lives and saved lives and had learned to carry both without letting either one show. He looked at Clara with the expression she had come to recognize as his default. The expression of a man who expected the world to organize itself according to his specifications and was perpetually calibrating the degree of his disappointment when it did not. "Sergeant Benson," he said, "I understand you have concerns about the menu change." Clara stood at attention. Her hands were at her sides. The shaking had stopped. Something else had replaced it, something she recognized from deep in the architecture of herself, from the place where she stored the things that kept her standing when everything else wanted her to fold. "Sir," she said, "with respect, the menu you approved was designed for this specific event. The duck breast with cherry reduction was selected because it bridges American technique with European flavor profiles. The risotto is a shared culinary tradition across all 3 allied nations represented tonight. The mousse is French in origin, but executed with American ingredients. Every dish on that menu was chosen to say something, sir, not just to feed people, to communicate respect for their culinary traditions while showcasing ours." General Briggs looked at her. He was not accustomed to being given culinary lectures by NCOs. He was not accustomed to being given lectures by anyone. "Sergeant," he said, "I appreciate your creativity, but tonight is about showing strength. Filet mignon, baked potato, apple pie. This is what America puts on the table. This is the message." Clara took a breath. One breath. The kind that fills the whole chest and holds for a second before releasing. The kind that people take before they do something they cannot take back. "Sir," she said, "I will not serve that menu." The kitchen did not breathe. The words hung in the air like smoke, visible, weightless, impossible to put back in the fire that made them. Captain Torres, standing 3 feet behind General Briggs, made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a cough, but existed in the terrified space between the two. The prep cooks were statues. The stock had the decency to stop simmering. General Briggs looked at Clara Benson. He looked at her for a long time, long enough for the fluorescent light above them to flicker once, which it did sometimes, which Clara knew because she had spent hundreds of hours under that light, and knew its rhythms the way she knew the rhythm of her own pulse. "Excuse me," he said. Clara did not repeat herself. She did not need to. The word was still in the room. No. It occupied the space between them like a physical object, solid, dimensional, taking up room that had previously belonged to the assumption that Clara Benson was a person who followed orders without question because she was just the cook, and cooks do not say no to generals, and the system that created both of them had never made space for this moment, had never imagined that a woman with flour on her apron and 15 years of invisible excellence behind her would stand in a military kitchen and refuse. "Sir," Clara said, and her voice was level, not loud, not defiant, not angry, level in the way that a foundation is level, the thing that everything else rests on. "I have spent 6 weeks preparing this menu. Every element has been tested, timed, and approved. If I switch to filet mignon and baked potatoes 2 hours before service, the quality will suffer. I will be serving food. I am not proud of the people who deserve better. And the message it sends will not be strength, sir. The message it sends will be that we are not capable of sophistication, that we have nothing to offer except size. I believe the Army is more than that. I believe this kitchen is more than that. And I will not put my name on a plate that says otherwise." She did not plan this speech. She did not rehearse it. It came from the same place her cooking came from, the place below language, below strategy, below the calculations of career and consequence that a rational person would have made before opening their mouth to a 4-star general. It came from the place where Clara Benson kept the conviction that feeding people was not a low-status job, that food was not decoration, that the woman at the stove was not a servant, but an artist and a professional and a human being with expertise that deserved to be respected even when it contradicted the preferences of the most powerful person in the room. General Briggs stared at her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the thing that generals' eyes do when they're deciding whether to destroy something or reconsider their position, and the two options look almost identical from the outside. The kitchen waited. "Sergeant Benson," General Briggs said. His voice was quiet, which was worse. Clara had heard him yell. Yelling was manageable. Yelling was weather. This quiet was something else. This quiet was the sound a building makes before it falls. "Are you refusing a direct order?" Clara could feel her heartbeat in her teeth. "Sir," she said, "I am telling you that serving an inferior menu to international allies is not in the best interest of this command. I'm doing my job, sir. My job is to ensure that the food that leaves this kitchen represents the best of what the United States Army can do. The menu I prepare does that. The menu you are proposing does not. Not because filet mignon is bad food, sir, but because it is the wrong food for this occasion, prepared in the wrong time frame, and it will not meet the standard that you yourself have demanded from this kitchen since you took command." She was using his own words against him. She knew it. He knew it. The kitchen knew it. General Briggs had arrived at Fort Myer, demanding excellence in all things, at all times, and Clara was standing in front of him, saying that she was the only person in the room willing to deliver exactly that, and he was the one standing in her way. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Clara counted. She counted because counting gave her brain something to do besides panic. And panic was a door she could not afford to open, because if she opened it, she would walk through it. And on the other side was the end of her career and possibly the end of the version of herself that she had spent 15 years building one meal at a time. General Briggs turned to Captain Torres. "What time is service?" 7 o'clock, sir." The general looked at Clara. He looked at the duck breasts on the tray. He looked at the ramekins of chocolate mousse visible through the walk-in cooler window, each one topped with its perfect curl of candied orange peel. "Serve the original menu," he said. He turned and walked out of the kitchen. The swinging doors closed behind him. The stock resumed simmering. The prep cooks resumed breathing. And Captain Torres looked at Clara with an expression that was equal parts terror and awe. The face of a man who has just watched someone jump off a cliff and land on their feet. Clara walked to the stove. She checked the temperature of the stock. She adjusted the burner by a quarter turn. She picked up a spoon and tasted the consommé. It needed salt. She added salt. The dinner was flawless. Clara served every course with the precision she had rehearsed. The duck breast was seared to a mahogany crust with a center that blushed pink, resting on the cherry reduction that gleamed like a jewel on the white plate. The risotto was creamy and earthy and exactly right. The mousse was dark and smooth, and the edible flour on top trembled when the plate was set down, the only thing in the room that was visibly shaking. Clara did not attend the dinner. She stood in the kitchen and orchestrated the service from behind the swinging doors, watching the plates leave and the plates return, reading the plates the way a doctor reads charts. How much was eaten, what was left, what was scraped clean. The plates came back empty. All of them. 3 courses, 200 plates, and everyone came back with nothing on it but the memory of what had been there. After the last plate was cleared, after the servers had retired, and the kitchen was quiet, and the dish station had been broken down, and the counters wiped, and the floors mopped, Clara stood alone in the kitchen. The fluorescent light flickered its familiar flicker. The walk-in cooler hummed. Outside the window, the rosemary in the stone planter was invisible in the dark, but she could smell it through the glass, which was probably not possible, but was true anyway. Kate's found her there 20 minutes later. Kate's had attended the dinner as a guest, the first time in her 29-year career that she had been invited to sit at the table instead of standing behind it. She walked into the kitchen still in her dress uniform, her shoes clicking on the tile, and she looked at Clara, and Clara looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a while. The British attaché, Kate said, told the general it was the finest military meal he had ever been served. He said it was better than anything he'd eaten at Sandhurst. Clara nodded. The French representative asked if we had hired a civilian chef. Clara's mouth did a thing that was almost a smile. The general, Kate said, and she paused. The general told them it was prepared by his culinary team. He said, and I am quoting, "We have exceptional people in every role in this army, including the kitchen." Clara leaned against the counter. The stainless steel was cool against her back. She closed her eyes. "He didn't say your name," Kate said softly. But he looked at the kitchen doors when he said it, and everyone at that table turned and looked too. Clara Benson stood in a military kitchen at 10:30 at night with her eyes closed, and the smell of rosemary coming through the window, and the knowledge that for the first time in 15 years, someone with 4 stars on his shoulder had looked at her work and called it exceptional in front of people who mattered. He had not said her name. He had looked at the doors behind which she stood. And the distinction between those two things, being named and being seen, was a distance she had been traveling her entire life. The aftermath of that evening unfolded in ways Clara did not expect. General Briggs did not reprimand her. He did not write her up for insubordination. He did not transfer her or punish her or pretend the confrontation had not happened. What he did was stranger and, in the long run, more significant. He began to consult her. Before every major event, his aide would call the kitchen and ask for Sergeant Benson's input on the menu. Not her compliance. Her input, her opinion, her expertise. He treated her, gradually and without announcement, as what she had always been, a professional with knowledge he did not have, operating in a domain he did not understand, producing results he could not achieve without her. Clara was promoted to Master Sergeant the following year. The promotion was accompanied by a letter of recommendation from General Briggs that described her as an exceptional leader whose commitment to excellence and professional courage have elevated the standard of culinary operations across the installation. Professional courage. He used those words, 2 words that acknowledged, without directly saying so, that she had stood in front of him and said no, and that he had, upon reflection, recognized this as an act of leadership rather than defiance. She served at Fort Myer for 3 more years. During that time, she trained a generation of young cooks, teaching them what Kate's had taught her and what her mother had taught her before that. That feeding people is not a job description. It is a responsibility, and the difference between doing it adequately and doing it well is the difference between keeping someone alive and making them glad to be alive. She retired from the Army in 2009 after 20 years of service. Her retirement ceremony was held in the same officers' club where she had served the duck breast that changed everything. 300 people attended. Kate's was there, retired now herself, sitting in the front row with the same gray eyes and the same expression that meant more than any word she had ever spoken. General Briggs, also retired, sent a letter that was read aloud. It said in part that Sergeant First Class Clara Benson had taught him that strength is not always loud, that courage does not always carry a weapon, and that the most powerful word in the English language is sometimes the smallest one. Clara listened to the letter. She was wearing her dress uniform for the last time. The creases were sharp. She had ironed it 3 times. After the ceremony, after the handshakes, and the photographs, and the folded flag, and the plaque that she would put in the same box with the first plaque, and the note that said "Trust Benson," Clara walked to the kitchen. The new team was prepping dinner. They did not know she was coming. She walked through the swinging doors and stood there and smelled the stock on the stove and the bread in the oven and the faint trace of rosemary that came through the window from the planter in the courtyard where the plant had grown wilder and thicker in the years she had been there, untrimmed and untamed and alive. A young private looked up from the prep station and said, "Can I help you, ma'am?" Clara looked at the private. She was maybe 19. Flour on her hands. An apron tied tight around a frame that was built solid, short, the kind of body that got strong from carrying things heavier than itself. "You the cook?" Clara asked. The private straightened up. "Yes, ma'am." Clara looked at her for a moment. She looked at the flour on the girl's hands and the knife on the cutting board and the stock pot on the stove where something was simmering that smelled like it had been made by someone who was paying attention. Someone who cared. Good, Clara said. She walked out of the kitchen, through the swinging doors, past the dining room where 300 chairs were being folded and stacked through the front door of the officers' club, and into the October air. She did not look back. She did not need to. The kitchen was still running. The stock was still simmering. Someone was still standing at the stove, paying attention, making something good out of whatever they had been given. That was enough. That had always been enough. Clara Benson opened a catering company in Falls Church, Virginia, in 2010. She called it Benson's Table. The logo was simple: a wooden spoon crossed with a chef's knife, the tools of her two lives, the domestic and the professional, the mother's kitchen and the military's. She started with small events, neighborhood gatherings, church receptions, a birthday party for a retired colonel who had eaten her food at Fort Myer and had spent 3 years trying to find her. The business grew. It grew the way Clara had always grown, without announcement, without spectacle, through the accumulated evidence of work done well. People ate her food and told other people. Those people booked her for their events. They told more people. Within 2 years, she was catering corporate events, embassy parties, and the occasional military function where she would walk into a kitchen that smelled like every kitchen she had ever stood in and feel the ghosts of every meal she had ever made standing beside her at the stove. She hired young cooks. Some of them were veterans. Some of them were kids who had never held a knife properly. She taught them all the same way, standing close, doing it right, trusting that they would absorb what they needed to absorb. She never yelled. She did not need to. In 2014, Clara was invited to speak at a culinary conference in Washington, D.C. The topic was excellence under constraint, lessons from institutional kitchens. She stood at a podium in front of 300 civilian chefs and food industry professionals, and she told them about the oatmeal, about the pilaf, about the night she said no to a 4-star general over a duck breast. She told them about her mother, about the stove that was a throne, about the meals that were proof. She told them that every kitchen is a country, and every cook is the citizen and the sovereign of that country, and that the food that comes out of that kitchen is not just sustenance, but language, a way of saying to the person who eats it, you matter. You are worth the effort. You are worth the extra pinch of salt and the 45 minutes of stirring and the candied orange peel placed with tweezers at 11 o'clock at night. She told them that being called just the cook was the most important label she had ever worn, because it meant she was the one who fed people, and feeding people is the oldest, most essential, most sacred act of human civilization, and anyone who calls it low status has never been hungry and has never been fed by someone who loved them. The room was quiet when she finished. Quiet the way a room gets when someone has said something true and the truth needs a moment to settle into the chairs and the walls and the bones of the people sitting in them. Then the room stood up. 300 people stood up and clapped, and some of them were crying, and Clara Benson stood at the podium with her hands gripping the edges because her hands were doing the shaking thing again, the vibration that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with 15 years of silence finally breaking open into sound. She stepped back from the podium. She smoothed her jacket. She walked off the stage with the same quiet purpose she had brought to every kitchen she had ever entered. Someone in the audience, a food journalist from a national magazine, wrote about Clara's speech. The article was titled "The General and the Cook." It was read by 2 million people in the first week. Clara's catering business tripled in size. She was invited to appear on cooking shows. She was offered a book deal. She was nominated for a James Beard Award for Community Impact. She accepted some of these things. She declined others. She made her choices the way she had always made her choices, based on whether they would put her closer to or further from the stove. The stove was still the center. The stove was still the country. Clara Benson is 54 years old now. She runs Benson's Table out of a commercial kitchen in Falls Church that she owns outright, purchased with money she earned one plate at a time. She employs 12 people. She still cooks every day. She still tastes every dish before it leaves the kitchen. She still adjusts the seasoning at the last moment. adding a pinch of something that is not in the recipe because she has never believed that a recipe card could hold everything a meal is supposed to say. On the wall of her kitchen, in a simple black frame, there's a note written in red ink on a printed menu. The note says, "Trust Benson." The duck breast on the menu has been crossed out and replaced with steak. Filet mignon, medium rare, American. The cherry reduction has been replaced with au jus. The risotto has been replaced with baked potato. Visitors sometimes ask about the framed menu. They ask why she keeps it, why she displays the document that represents the moment someone tried to erase her work and replace it with something ordinary. Clara looks at the menu. She looks at the red ink. She looks at the crossed-out dishes and the handwritten replacements and the 6 words at the bottom. "We serve American food to allies." And she smiles. Not a big smile. A small one. The kind that sits in the corner of the mouth and stays there because it knows something. She keeps it, she says, because it is the recipe card she did not follow. And not following it was the best dish she ever made.